What happens when a morning show interview goes so wrong that the guest is escorted offset before the commercial break? That's exactly what happened when Meghan Markle sat down with George Stephanopoulos on Good Morning America. And what you're about to witness is one of the most explosive moments in morning television history. Before we get into it, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling me whose side you're on by the end of this. Because trust me, you're going to have strong opinions. The studio lights were blazing hot that morning as Meghan Markle settled into the cream-colored chair across from George Stephanopoulos. The set was pristine, the energy buzzing with that particular electricity that comes when everyone knows they're about to witness something significant. Meghan had agreed to this interview to promote her latest venture, but George had other plans. He'd done his homework, and he wasn't interested in salt. George leaned forward slightly, his expression neutral, but his eyes sharp. Meghan, thank you for joining us this morning. I want to start with something that's been on a lot of people's minds. You've spoken extensively about your experience with the royal family, about feeling silenced, about mental health struggles, but there are people, including some of your own family members, who say that your version of events doesn't match up with what actually happened. How do you respond to that? Meghan's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. George, I think what's important to remember is that truth is truth. My truth, my lived experience. That's not something that can be debated by people who weren't in the room, who weren't living my life. But that's an interesting phrase, isn't it? My truth? George didn't miss a beat. Truth is supposed to be objective. Either something happened or it didn't. When you say my truth, are you acknowledging that there might be other equally valid versions of these events? You could see the shift in Meghan's posture, the way her shoulders pulled back just slightly. I think you're twisting my words, George. What I experienced was real. The pain was real. The racism was real. Just because some people want to deny that doesn't make it any less true. I'm not denying anything, George replied, his voice steady. I'm asking for clarity. You made some very serious allegations. You suggested that there were concerns within the royal family about how dark your son's skin might be. That's an incredibly serious charge. But you've never named who said it? You've never provided specific details. Don't you think if something that serious happened, the public deserves more than vague insinuations? We chose not to name names to protect people. Meghan's voice had an edge now. That was a kindness on our part. A kindness, George tilted his head, or a way to make an accusation without having to back it up. Because if someone really said something that racist, why would you protect them? Why would you worry about their reputation when they clearly didn't worry about your son's well-being? Meghan's jaw tightened. You're putting words in my mouth again, George. This is exactly the kind of interrogation I was talking about. The kind of hostile environment where women, especially women of color, are made to feel like they're always on trial. Always having to prove themselves. Always having to justify their own experiences. I'm a journalist, George said simply. Asking questions is what I do. And I think these are questions a lot of people want answered. Let's talk about your relationship with your father. You've said he betrayed you, that he staged photos with paparazzi, that he's spoken to the press against your wishes. But he's also said that you've cut him off, that you won't let him see his grandchildren, that he found out you were pregnant from the news like everyone else. Is any of that true? My father made his choices. Meghan's voice was cold now. He chose to collaborate with tabloids. He chose money over his daughter. Those were his decisions. But did you cut him off? It's a yes or no question, Meghan. Life isn't yes or no. George, relationships are complicated. That sounds like a yes. George pressed on. And your half-sister, Samantha, she's been quite vocal about feeling abandoned by you. She says you rewrote history, that you were never close. But she has photos, emails, evidence that you were in contact, that you did have a relationship. Why the contradiction? Samantha has been trying to profit off my name for years, Meghan shot back. She changed her last name back to Markle only after I started dating Harry. Before that, she wanted nothing to do with that name. So forgive me if I don't take her sudden need for sisterly connection very seriously. George nodded slowly. Fair point. But that doesn't answer the question about whether you were close or not. See? This is the pattern I'm noticing. When uncomfortable questions come up, you pivot to how you've been victimized rather than addressing the actual question. Because I have been victimized. George, Meghan's voice rose slightly. Do you know what it's like to have the entire British press coming after you every single day? To have lies written about you that millions of people believe? To have your character assassinated while you're pregnant, while you're struggling with your mental health? I'm sure that was incredibly difficult, George acknowledged. But you also courted that press when it suited you, didn't you? The carefully arranged paparazzi shots, the strategic leaks to friendly journalists, the tell-all interview with Oprah. You can't have it both ways. You can't want privacy and also want to control the narrative. That's not fair, isn't it? George leaned back. You signed a massive deal with Netflix. You and Harry put out a docuseries where you shared intimate details of your lives, your marriage, your problems with the royal family. That's the opposite of wanting privacy. That's monetizing your story. We wanted to tell our truth, Meghan insisted. On our own terms, in our own words, without the filter of the tabloid media. There's that phrase again. Our truth. George's expression remained neutral, but his tone was pointed. Meghan, I've watched that documentary. I've listened to your podcast. I've read the interviews. And I keep coming back to the same question. If things were really as bad as you say, if you were really as isolated and unsupported as you claim, how did you manage to orchestrate what appears to be a very calculated exit? How did you secure lawyers, set up business deals, arrange interviews, all while supposedly being kept prisoner by the institution? Meghan's eyes flashed. Are you suggesting I'm lying? I'm suggesting there are inconsistencies in your narrative that deserve scrutiny. You've made very serious accusations against one of the world's most prominent families. You've damaged reputations, caused rifts, created international incidents. The least you can do is answer legitimate questions about those accusations. This interview is supposed to be about my new project, Meghan said, her voice tight. Not a trial about my past. Your past is relevant when you've built your entire brand on being a victim of that past, George countered. You can't sell yourself as the woman who stood up to the monarchy and then get upset when people want to examine that story more closely. The tension in the studio was palpable now. The crew members stood frozen, unsure whether to intervene. This had gone far beyond the typical morning show conversation. This was a confrontation. Let's talk about Kate, George continued. You told Oprah that Kate made you cry before your wedding, that the tabloids had the story backwards when they reported you made her cry. But people close to Kate say that's not the whole story, that there was a disagreement about flower girl dresses and that both of you were upset. Why frame it as though you were the only victim in that situation? Because I was the one the press vilified, Meghan said. I was the one they called difficult, demanding, a diva. Kate got to be the perfect princess while I was turned into a monster. That's the difference, George. That's what you don't understand. When Kate has a bad day, she's humanized. When I have a bad day, I'm attacked. Or maybe, George said carefully, when Kate has a disagreement with someone, she doesn't run to Oprah and make it a global news story. Maybe that's the difference. Meghan stood up abruptly. I don't have to sit here and be attacked like this. Sit down, Meghan. George's voice was firm but not loud. You agreed to this interview. You wanted the platform. Now you're getting questions you don't like and you want to run away. Isn't that exactly what you've been doing all along? Running away when things get difficult. You have no idea what you're talking about. Meghan remained standing, her hands trembling slightly. Then enlighten me, George challenged. Sit down and explain it to me. Make me understand. Because right now, from where I'm sitting, it looks like you and Harry wanted all the benefits of being royal without any of the responsibilities. You wanted the titles, the money, the platform, the influence. But you didn't want to follow the rules, respect the traditions, or deal with criticism. Meghan slowly lowered herself back into the chair, but her body language screamed defiance. She crossed her legs deliberately, folded her hands in her lap, and fixed George with a stare that could freeze water. You want me to explain? Fine. Let me tell you what it's like to marry into a family where you're not wanted from day one, where every single thing you do is scrutinized, criticized, and twisted into something sinister. I'm listening, George said, his expression unchanged. From the moment our relationship became public, the attacks started. The tabloids dug into every aspect of my life. My family was harassed, my friends were harassed, my ex-boyfriends were contacted. They went through my social media posts from years ago, trying to find anything they could use against me, and the palace did nothing. They released statements protecting other members of the family, but when it came to me, suddenly it was radio silence. George nodded. That does sound difficult. But Meghan, you were an actress. You had a public profile. You had social media with thousands of followers. You gave interviews. You had a lifestyle blog. You weren't exactly a private person before, Harry. Didn't you expect some level of media attention when you started dating a prince? There's media attention, and then there's a coordinated campaign of destruction, Meghan shot back. They didn't just report on me. They tried to destroy me. They called me everything from a social climber to a prostitute. They said I was using Harry, that I was manipulating him, that I had some master plan to infiltrate the royal family. How is that fair? How is that journalism? It's not, George agreed. The tabloid press can be vicious and irresponsible. But here's what I'm struggling with. You knew what you were getting into. Harry had been in the public eye his entire life. You saw what happened to Diana, what happened to Kate. The media circus is part of the package. So why act surprised when it happened to you? Because I thought I would be protected, Meghan said, her voice cracking slightly. I thought the family, the institution, would have my back. Instead, they fed me to the wolves. They leaked stories about me, briefed against me, used me as a scapegoat for their own problems. Do you have proof of that? George asked. Proof that the palace deliberately leaked negative stories about you. Meghan hesitated. I know what I know. That's not proof, Meghan. That's speculation. You're accusing people of orchestrating a smear campaign against you, but you're not providing any evidence, just feelings and suspicions. Sometimes you don't need a smoking gun to know what's happening, Meghan insisted. When stories appear in multiple papers on the same day with the same angle, when they all quote unnamed palace sources, when the information is things that only certain people would know, you connect the dots. Or, George countered, you're paranoid. You're under enormous stress. You're in a foreign country. You're dealing with unprecedented scrutiny. And you start seeing conspiracies where there might just be garden-variety gossip and opportunistic journalism. Now you're calling me paranoid. I'm offering an alternative explanation, George clarified. Look, I don't doubt that you had a hard time. I don't doubt that the media was often unfair to you. But you've elevated your personal struggles into this grand narrative of institutional racism and deliberate sabotage. And I'm not sure the facts support that interpretation. Meghan's face flushed. The facts? You want facts? Fine. When Kate was pregnant, the press wrote glowing stories about her morning sickness. How brave she was, how she was glowing despite the illness. When I was pregnant, they wrote that I was holding my bump too much, that I was attention-seeking, that I was breaking protocol. Same situation, completely different coverage. Explain that, George. Different people, different contexts, different times, George said. Kate had been with William for years before they got married. The public felt like they knew her. You came in as an outsider, an American, a divorcee, biracial, an actress. Like it or not, that made you more of a curiosity, more of a lightning rod. It doesn't make it right, but it explains the difference in coverage. So you're saying I deserved it because I was different? I'm saying I understand why the coverage was different. That's not the same as saying you deserved it. George's patience seemed endless, his tone never wavering. But Meghan, you have to take some responsibility for how you responded to that coverage. You could have kept your head down, done the work, proved people wrong over time. Instead, you fought back publicly, which only fed the narrative that you were difficult and didn't understand how things worked. I wasn't going to be silent while they destroyed my reputation. No, you just waited until you left and then destroyed everyone else's reputation instead, George said. And the words hung in the air like a bomb. Meghan's mouth opened, then closed. That's not what I did, isn't it? You went on international television and accused the royal family of racism. You suggested that they drove you to suicidal thoughts. You painted Harry as a victim who needed to be rescued from his own family. You turned private family matters into public entertainment. And you did it all under the guise of telling your truth. That's not self-defense, Meghan. That's retaliation. They wouldn't let me speak for myself, Meghan said, her voice rising. Every time I wanted to respond to a story, I was told no. Every time I wanted to correct the record, I was silenced. The Oprah interview was the first time I got to tell people what really happened. From your perspective, George emphasized, what really happened from your perspective? But you presented it as objective fact. You made accusations without evidence. You hurt people who couldn't respond because of protocol. You knew they were bound by never complain, never explain, And you exploited that. You took advantage of their silence to paint yourself as the victim and them as the villains. That's not true. Then why hasn't Harry spoken to his brother in years? Why did you skip the Queen's funeral events? Why do your children barely know their cousins? If you were really interested in reconciliation, in healing, wouldn't you be making more of an effort? Meghan's eyes were bright with tears now, but her voice remained steady. You don't heal by going back to the place that hurt you. You don't reconcile with people who refuse to acknowledge what they did wrong. We extended olive branches. We tried. They rejected us, did you? George pressed. Because from what I understand, your idea of extending an olive branch is demanding an apology first. Your idea of reconciliation is everyone admitting you were right and they were wrong. That's not compromise, Meghan. That's capitulation. I'm not going to apologize for standing up for myself and my family. No one's asking you to apologize for that, George said. What people want is for you to acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, you weren't completely blameless in all of this. That maybe you made mistakes too. That maybe your perspective isn't the only valid one. So I should just admit I was wrong. Admit that everything I experienced wasn't real. There's a middle ground between admitting you were completely wrong and insisting you were completely right, George said. It's called nuance. It's called humility. It's called recognizing that most conflicts involve fault on both sides. Meghan wiped at her eyes angrily. This is unbelievable. You invited me here to promote my work, and instead you're putting me on trial for leaving. A situation that was destroying my mental health. What kind of journalism is this? The honest kind, George replied. The kind where I don't just accept your narrative at face value. Because you're famous or because you've positioned yourself as a victim. You came on this show knowing my reputation. You knew I wasn't going to throw you so don't act shocked that I'm asking real questions. These aren't questions, George. This is an ambush. No, an ambush is what you did to the royal family when you sat down with Oprah without warning them first. This is an interview where the subject is being held accountable for their public statements. There's a difference. Meghan stood up again, and this time she didn't sit back down. When George gestured to the chair, I'm done here. This is hostile, it's unfair, and I don't have to subject myself to this. You're free to leave any time, George said calmly. But before you do, let me ask you one more question. Do you think Harry is happy? Really happy? Because, from where I'm sitting, it looks like you took a man who had his problems but who had his family, his country, his military connections, his charity work, his identity, and you've isolated him in California, thousands of miles from everything he knew. You've turned him against his family, made him financially dependent on media deals about the very privacy you claim to want, and reduced him to being your supporting player. So I'll ask again, do you think Harry is happy? Meghan's face went white. How dare you? Harry made his own choices. He chose to leave. He chose our family over that institution. He chose love over duty. Don't you dare suggest I manipulated him. I'm not suggesting it, George said quietly. I'm stating it as a possibility that deserves consideration, because everyone who knows Harry, who has known him for decades, says he's changed. They say he's not the same person. They say he's angry, isolated, and lost, and the only common denominator in that change is you. This interview is over. Meghan's voice was shaking now. I'm leaving. Then leave, George said, spreading his hands. But you'll just be proving my point. When things get uncomfortable, when you're challenged, when someone doesn't accept your version of events, you run. You did it with the royal family. You're doing it now with me. Maybe the problem isn't everyone else, Meghan. Maybe it's you. Meghan reached for her microphone pack, fumbling with the wire clipped to her dress. A producer rushed forward, hands up in a placating gesture. But Meghan waved her away. Don't touch me. I want this off now. George remained seated, watching the scene unfold with an expression that was difficult to read. Not smug, not satisfied, just observant. Meghan, if you walk off this set, you're making headlines for all the wrong reasons. Is that really what you want? What I want, Meghan said, finally unhooking the microphone and dropping it onto the chair, is to be treated with basic respect, something you clearly don't understand. I respect you enough to treat you like an adult who can handle tough questions, George replied. That's more respect than you're giving yourself right now by acting like a child throwing a tantrum. The words hit like a slap. Meghan froze, her hand still on the chair. For a moment, it seemed like she might actually sit back down, might try to regain some composure. But then her jaw set in a hard line. A child. Her voice was dangerously quiet. You sit there in your comfortable chair, with your network backing you, with your reputation intact, and you call me a child for refusing to be bullied on national television. You're not being bullied, George said, his voice still maddeningly calm. You're being questioned. There's a profound difference. Bullying is what you've accused the royal family of doing to you. Questioning is what journalists do to public figures who make controversial claims. If you can't tell the difference, that's concerning. I know the difference, George, and I know what this is. This is a hit job. Someone got to you, didn't they? Someone from the palace, someone from the family. They fed you talking points, gave you angles to pursue. This whole thing was set up to make me look bad. George actually laughed at that, a short, humorless sound. Meghan, I don't need anyone to feed me talking points. I have eyes. I have ears. I've watched your interviews, read your statements, followed your story. The questions I'm asking are the questions any thinking person would ask. The fact that you see legitimate scrutiny as a conspiracy tells me everything I need to know about your mindset. My mindset is that I deserve to be treated fairly, to be heard, to be believed. You have been heard, George said. The entire world heard you on Oprah. Millions of people heard you in your Netflix series. You've been heard more than most people ever will be in their entire lives. The problem is that being heard doesn't mean being agreed with. It doesn't mean your version of events goes unchallenged. And that's what you can't accept. Meghan grabbed her purse from beside the chair. I'm not doing this anymore. Where's my security? A large man in a dark suit appeared from the wings, walking toward Meghan with purpose. George glanced at him, then back at Meghan. So that's it. You're just going to walk away without addressing anything I've said. What's there to address? Meghan's voice was brittle now. You've already made up your mind about me. You and everyone else who's determined to see me as the villain in this story. It doesn't matter what I say, how I explain it, what evidence I provide. People like you have decided who I am, and nothing I do will change that. That's the victim complex talking again, George observed. It's always someone else's fault. It's always a conspiracy against you. It's never just that people disagree with your choices or question your narrative. Meghan turned to face him fully, her security guard now at her side. You want to know what the real story is, George? The real story is that I was a woman who dared to not play by rules that were designed to keep me small. I dared to speak up, to ask for help, to expect the same protection and support that others in that family received. And for that, I was punished. I was driven out, and now people like you continue that punishment by refusing to see me as anything other than a troublemaker who didn't know her place. Or, George said, standing now for the first time since the interview began, you were a woman who wanted all the perks of royalty without any of the obligations, who wanted to change centuries of tradition to accommodate your preferences, who expected special treatment and threw a public fit when you didn't get it. And now you've built an entire brand around being the victim of circumstances you largely created yourself. The studio had gone completely silent. Every crew member was frozen, watching this train wreck unfold. The cameras were still rolling, capturing every second of what would undoubtedly become one of the most talked about moments in morning television history. Meghan's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but the microphones picked it up perfectly. You're a bully, George, just like all the rest, and history will prove me right. History doesn't care about your feelings, Meghan, George replied. It cares about facts, and the facts are that you've left a trail of broken relationships, damaged reputations, and burned bridges wherever you've gone. At some point, you have to ask yourself if everyone else is really the problem. Meghan didn't respond. She turned and walked toward the exit, her security guard following close behind. But George wasn't done. One more thing, he called out, and despite herself, Meghan paused. When this airs, and it will air, people are going to see exactly who you are. Not the victim you pretend to be, not the misunderstood duchess, but someone who can't handle being challenged. Someone who runs when the questions get hard. Is that really the legacy you want? Meghan looked back over her shoulder, her eyes glistening. The only legacy I care about is the one my children will remember. And they'll know their mother stood up for herself, even when the whole world was against her. Even when the whole world includes your own father, your own sister, your husband's family, and apparently "Anyone who asks you a direct question," George said, "that's not the whole world being against you, Meghan. That's you being against the world." With that, Meghan Markle walked off the Good Morning America set. Within seconds, producers were swarming, phones were ringing, and chaos erupted. George returned to his chair, straightened his notes, and looked directly into the camera. "We'll be right back," he said calmly, as if nothing extraordinary had just happened. But something extraordinary had happened. An interview that was supposed to be a friendly promotional appearance had turned into a brutal examination of one woman's narrative, her choices, and her inability to accept responsibility for any of it. The footage would be replayed endlessly, analyzed frame by frame, and debated for weeks to come. Some would say George was too harsh, that he crossed a line from journalism into cruelty. Others would say he simply asked the questions everyone was thinking but too afraid to voice. But one thing was certain: Meghan Markle would never sit down for an interview quite like that again. So what do you think? Was George right to push as hard as he did, or did he go too far? Drop a comment below with your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. I want to hear from you. Do you think Meghan will ever do another mainstream media interview after this? Or has she learned that controlling the narrative means avoiding anyone who won't play along? Let me know in the comments.